guest of today is Sri Kiran Kumar S., a well-known social media analyst. He describes himself on Facebook as a curious man who is always hungry for more information. But trust me, if you follow or check his profile on Facebook or Twitter, he's already an encyclopedia himself. A connoisseur in the IT industry as an engineer with a remarkable experience of 25 years, along with being skilled and accomplished blogger, Kiran Kumar S. is a man of multiple talents. He is up with all his topics, subjects and issues, spreading awareness through his blogs, which have been published in several online news forums now. He is a passionate speaker and has appeared in so many news channels to share his views and ideas. Now I request Sri R.K. Punit from Balishta Bharata to welcome Mr. Kiran Kumar. Thank you, sir. Now I request Sri Kiran KS to take over for the further discussion.
Namaste everybody. In a normal circumstance, we would have started this meeting with a lot of positivity, a lot of ideas and everything. But today, I want to get that, what they call as the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? I want to get it out. How many of you are very angry right now with what happened today? Very angry. So we will walk out of this room after 1 hour, 1.5 hours, with answers for many of those anger. Okay? So we have an expert sitting here, experts I would say, and they'll be answering a lot of those questions. Why, what, how, everything. Okay? So I want you to leave that anger away and focus on the book, because this is an important occasion and there could not have been a better moment. It's a very sad day. At the same time, it's an occasion for all of us to ponder why those things happen. What caused it? Is it geopolitics? Is it a failure in our law and order? Is it judiciary? Is it politics? Is it our ideology? Is it our education? There are hundreds of questions, and all of you will get a chance. At least most of you will get a chance to ask those. So I want you to please focus on why you are here and what does it mean by the title of the book, because India comes first. I will take a couple of examples from the book and then we will go discuss it, okay? There are 5 sections in the book and it's a collection of letters, essays and thoughts written by Mr. Rama over the last 5 to 6 years. And it gives you a wonderful idea of the thought process and how things have changed. Whether you take the second part or the third part or the fifth part. Let me start with the geopolitics part of it. In one of the essays, he picks up the idea of Israel as a country and he tries to do a comparison with India. He talks about how Israel was formed just 8 months after India, what kind of problems it faced, and how our leadership took on the wounds of independence and the immediate challenges, and how Israel took it. Of course, size-wise, there's no comparison. There's a big difference. But the thought process, with the limited resources, what they could do when they had such hostile neighbors, it's a wonderful part. It's only like 3-4 pages, but when you read it, you will have an understanding of where we went wrong, and we still have a chance to pick it up. So whenever you read this book, that particular portion where he talks about Israel, please focus on it. I'll give an example. He narrates the first trip of Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he went to New York. And he was already addressing UN. He had to leave on Sunday night. And he wanted to meet the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu could not travel before the last day of Modi's visit. Okay, there was only an outlier chance of meeting because Jews don't really work on Saturdays; they have a Sabbath day, so he could not travel. So he narrates it so well, and there was a lot of panic call and all. Finally, long story short, they agreed to meet on Sunday night so that Mr. Modi can leave US and Mr. Netanyahu can continue his UN-related work after Sunday. But in the last minute, he recalled some very funny thing. Somebody in the Ministry of External Affairs started making panic calls to Israel, and Israelis were confused. Okay, what about the Palestine? What about Mr. Abbas? is he coming? Is he going to be there? His trip is not planned. How can Mr. Modi meet only the Israeli Prime Minister and not the Palestinian leader? This is what we call as our hyphenation in the geopolitics. You all know that when the American president or somebody comes to India, you know what the hyphen is, right? India hyphen Pakistan. They must always meet. Whenever you have that hyphenation in geopolitics, it's a big liability for us. So he describes so well in that book how Mr. Modi handled it. He broke the rules. He said, this is the new start. Just because I meet an Israeli Prime Minister, it doesn't mean we are against Palestine. We can always meet them next. So he very courageously broke the hyphenation. And as a result, last time when the United States President was here, you understood and you already observed that he already broke the hyphenation, which was not the case when Bill Clinton had come and others had come before, right? They had to do something for the hyphenation, but the hyphenation is removed from geopolitics. So he brings a lot of good thoughts on that Israel topic and the hyphenation part. That's the first part. The second thing that I want to tell is how he describes about South Africa. From Israel, let's go to South Africa. He describes some things that we were all very curious to know. Mahatma Gandhi, when he went as an immigrant to South Africa, when he was fighting cases, initially he fought cases only of Indians. He did not fight the cases of blacks, who were the majority there. And then he draws a comparison with Nelson Mandela, who was also an icon for non-violence. When Nelson Mandela started the anti-apartheid, in the book he writes that he only picked up the blacks, the African natives with him. He did not pick the Indians with him because there was a class struggle there. So he tries to explain how Mahatma Gandhi later matured and took everybody with him, and how Mandela later matured and took everybody with him. So that whole analogy that he talks about, we'll talk more about it, but that's a very good thing that I like. The third thing is about United States. He talks a lot about United States and the policy and the geopolitics, and we will ask him some questions. What happened today is something that we probably saw a month back in Washington DC. Something very similar happened. So we will have a lot to learn from him on how some agendas, narratives are set, which are essentially copy of things from United States. In US, race is the biggest problem, right? Everybody talks about race and the slavery that they have from the last 300 years, the baggage that they carry. In India, the same people, some ideology people, usually the left of center, they carry the same thing and they bring caste into it and they draw parallels. Even though there's no parallel in some cases, they draw. If they say Black Lives Matter, they remove the black and they add some particular caste and say this caste life matters. This whole narrative, how they said, and what are the things we can learn, and most importantly, how do we prevent some of the problems that America faced in the last few years from repeating here? So those are some of the things that we will definitely ask him. The last part about my initial thing would be Turkey. So he talks about Israel, talks about South Africa. There's a beautiful coverage of, there are a lot of other coverage, debate and everything, but I only covered these four. There is a reason. One is a black majority country, one is a white majority country, one is a Jewish majority country, one is a Muslim majority country. So I'm covering these four. So he talked about Turkey, and he talks very highly of Mustafa Kemal, how they followed the real secularism, not the Indian secularism, the real secularism they followed. And he brings up that Hagia Sophia and that 1,000 year of the Byzantine thing and the 6 isms that Kemal Pasha talked about. Real secularism. It's not written as real, but I'm emphasizing on that. Secularism, pluralism, statism, federalism, all sorts of isms he talks about. So we will try to ask him a little bit more, because our civilization has always been that Ana Bhadram, that whole thing is there, right? Where we get the noble thought, the noble thoughts come from everywhere. So we can learn from Israel, we can learn from South Africa's experience, we can learn from the United States' bad experience recently, and we can also learn from Turkey's changes that have happened, which are actually nullifying some of the good things that Turkey had for 100 years. So we can learn about all these. The reason I'm picking mostly on geopolitics is because that's where we have to learn. We have to learn from their mistakes, we have to learn from their successes. So with that being said, I would now, that's just a basic introduction onto things, but there are plenty of sections, there are a lot of things. I would now invite upon Mr. Pai to give his introduction thoughts about the book, and then we will go into more of a discussion.
ಒಂದು ನಿಮಿಷ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಪೃಥ್ವಿಕ್ ಪೈಗಳು ಒಂದೇ ನಿಮಿಷ ಬನ್ನಿ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಡಿ. ರಾಮದಾಜ್ ಒಂದು ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಪೈಗಳು ಒಂದೇ ನಿಮಿಷ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಡಿ.
I now request the dignitaries to formally present the book to the audience.
This is a very fascinating book for many reasons. First of all, the title of the book, because India comes first. Nobody writes about India coming first nowadays. So it's very surprising that somebody actually believes that India comes first. And intriguing because Ram Madhavji is speaking about the voice of a patriot and a nationalist. At a time when patriotism and nationalism is supposedly to take a backseat, and Lutyens daily tells us it's not good to be a patriot, you should not be a nationalist, it's a bad word. But he has been writing about it. So my first question to you, Ram Madhavji, is why did you publish this book? And what makes you a patriot and a nationalist? I know you are from the RSS, you are supposed to be a patriot nationalist, but from your heart, right from the time you grew up, what made you a patriot and a nationalist, and wear it on your sleeve and talk about it so very openly?
Thank you, Mr. Mohandas Pai, and thank you, Kiran, for that introduction. I now realize that I have written so many of those things. Let me first take a couple of minutes to explain about the title of the book. Because India comes first. I mean, the easiest way for me is that I have not picked up the title, the Amazon has picked up. But it's the title of one of my articles. This is about this thinking of the ruling dispensation today. Those who are running this country, right from Honorable Prime Minister down the line, all those people belonging to that particular national school of thought. For us, whatever we do, all the actions we take, behind those actions is the only spirit, that is, because country comes first, because nation comes first, Rashtra Sarvopari. We are inspired by that one mission, one vision, one goal, that nation should always come first. Party should be secondary, self-interest should be the last thing, but whatever we do should be for the good of the nation, for the interest of the nation. Now, it was mostly about the government's domestic policies, etc. that I used that phrase, because India comes first. Like, we took certain very harsh decisions also. Some even among this audience might not fully support those legalizations like demonetization, or that very bold decision of abrogating Article 370. These were not easy decisions to take. I can tell you about Article 370. This was, a lot of it was hollowed out from within by the previous government. In fact, since I handled Kashmir for many years, one very senior leader once told me, sir, you know what, this Article 370 has been hollowed out from within by starting with Nehru. But what Prime Minister Modi did was, look, there is an empty glass on the table. Why should it be there? So he simply threw it out. It's an empty glass anyway. The courage to remove that useless thing, which is not in our India's interest, was there in Prime Minister Modi. So whatever is in India's interest, with courage and with determination, we did. Mr. Pai rightly pointed out, we have lots of very eminent scholars in Lutyens, Delhi, for whom these are all, very bad words. You cannot be a patriot, you cannot be a nationalist. But to be a patriot is the very, very fundamental characteristic of every citizen. Today we are celebrating the 72nd Republic Day. What is the significance of this republic? We were ruled by the British. British government is not a republic. It's a monarchy, even today. It's a monarchic democracy, democratic monarchy. We are a democratic republic. What is republic? Republic is a system of government where people themselves are rulers. That is republic. People elect representatives to rule over them. This model is called the republic. That means this country is being run by the people, 1.3 billion Indians. That means you are going to be naturally patriotic because you are responsible for your country. It's another matter whether we do behave in that matter or not. It's a big question. In fact, at the very beginning of our journey of independence, when we were making the Indian Constitution, for that matter, it's not, I'm not criticizing the Constitution, but as a matter of fact, let me share with you, the entire Constitution does not call India as a nation. Do you know the Constitution begins by describing all of us as we, the people of India. When this phrase was being inserted, some people raised objection, told Ambedkar that why do you borrow from the American Constitution? American Constitution begins with that phrase, we, the people of the United States of America. That's how the American Constitution begins. So people, some conscientious leaders said, why don't you start the Constitution by saying we the Indian nation? Why not straight away say that we are a nation? Because we called we the people of India. About the description of India in Article 1, we said India is a union of states. Rajam ka Sangh hai. India is a nation, Mahavir ne kaha hai. So Ambedkar gives a very profound answer. He says that look, nationalism is a spiritual sentiment. It's a spiritual consciousness. It should pervade in the hearts and minds and thinking and actions of people. Sadly, today, we lack that consciousness. This Ambedkar was talking in 1949. He said, what we have is caste consciousness, religious consciousness, language consciousness, this consciousness, that consciousness. We don't have a nation consciousness. So we better call ourselves the people. We are a nation in the making. One can dispute. Scholars here also can say that no, that was not the right. There can be a different opinion about it. But I'm saying that was the starting point. From there to today, look at the kind of a sense of nationhood that pervades the whole country. That is the kind of transformation we have gone through. I think that is what is patriotism or nationalism that even our Constitution wanted us to have. But only one bottom line that we must understand is this whole idea of patriotism, nationalism, it did not come to us from our Constitution only. It is the age-old Sanatan idea of this land. We always believe this country is our mother. In Vishnu Purana, we start by saying Mata Prithvi. This land is our motherland. In fact, the motherland idea is taken from us by many countries in the world. So, loving, respecting your mother country has been an integral part of our cultural, civilizational ethos. We missed it for various reasons. A stage came when we were making the Constitution. for our leaders to say that the consciousness is not there in our country. We have to build that consciousness, we have to make the nation. Finally, today, after 70 years, we can safely say that except for a minority group in Lutyens Delhi, largely people of this country accept this proposition that we are one nation, we are an ancient nation. The basis of our nationhood is our culture and civilization. I think that is the kind of nationhood and patriotism we should all have, we should imbibe in our country.
Now this leads to another interesting point you made in one of your essays, and particularly in the introduction, that India is a very different civilization that arose, asked very fundamental questions, unlike the Greeks and the Romans and Western civilization, who tried to make virtue of the human being. And India has always stood for an individual journey to find his own path and his own meaning. Now, can you explain to us the difference between the Western concept of a nation, of a people, of a person in relation to the nation or a country, and the Indian perception? Because people today are extremely confused. You know, they try to borrow the Western concept to explain India, and they don't exactly understand the Indian concept. And the Indian concept is the concept by which we are born, we live, we practice, we do everything else. Next, we have this idea hitting us every day. Our children are taught something in school, people talk about it, the English media talks about it. It doesn't resonate with us, and we go through a lot of confusion. And that hits at the bottom of what we are. Please explain to us the difference and what you think we should do in the future. Because you didn't say a beautiful thought.
In fact, one of the reasons why in our constitution, and I summarize it, in our constitution, why our then leadership did not want to use the word nation was because of the prejudice attached to it at that time. Because we were just freshly out of the Second World War. I mean, I'm talking about the Western experience. The Second World War, and for that matter the First World War, both World Wars had generally projected nationalism as a very cynical, negative, very chauvinistic idea. Hitler was a nationalist, supposed to be a European nationalist. So was Mussolini. So they had committed atrocities in the name of nationalism. So nationalism itself became a sort of not a very good idea. That's the reason why at the time of our constitution making, leaders were not readily willing to accept that word national to be inserted in our constitution. Probably. But we must remember about which, as by rightly pointed out, I have discussed in this book. In fact, I have come out with a detailed book on the whole idea. The concept of nation in Europe is hardly 200 to 250 years old. It all began with the formation of the nation states in 17th and 18th century. Before that, Europe never had the concept of nation per se. These nation states, their experience has given a particular meaning to nationality in the West, in Europe and in America. And in America, still there are questions about whether they are one nation yet or not. In fact, Samuel Huntington's last book in 2003 was titled, Who Are We? He asked Americans, who are we? America's search for identity. Do we have any American identity? You know, the recent incidents in America prove that they are still not clear about what is their identity. There is utter division today in American society. So why I am saying this is, the nation idea of the West is a very short-lived one. It has only a history of 200 to 250 years. Over the history of that 2 to 3 centuries, they tried to build a concept for nationhood which is essentially based on race, language and geography. Whereas India, the very idea of nation is a very positively evolved idea. It's not about race. It's not about language. It's not about your geography also. It's not about political history. It's about, in fact, in our very ancient literature, a shloka comes, Bhadramichanta Rishaya. The sages of this country had a benign wish. Bhadra Ichha is a benign wish. What is that benign wish? They say, for the abhyudayam, welfare and well-being of the mankind. They thought and thought over it. They had a penance, they had discussions, discourses over centuries, and they came up with the idea of a set of rules which we call as dharma. This dharma is not like a divine code ordained by some unknown entity to somebody who is a representative on the earth. It is something that has evolved through a very thoughtful discourse among the great minds of our country some millennia ago. That dharma created a national society here based on the dharmic values. A society was inspired to live as one united entity. So our nationhood is based on the dharmic values. It's not based on language. How many languages are there in India? It's not based on any political geography. India was never ruled by one single king until 1947. 1947 we had to unite 560 different kings and royalties. Then India became one united entity as a political entity, never one political entity, never one language, never one race. We had people from all over. Yet we lived as one people because the uniting factor here is our culture, our civilization, which is a product of our dharma, the value system. So here when we say nation, in fact the very translation of it, I don't know what is the translation in Kannada, but in Hindi, the translation is Rashtriya. Rashtra. Rashtra means it's a cultural idea. So India's nationalism is different from Western nationalism. Very interestingly, if you read Pandit Nehru, if you read his Discovery of India, he narrates the same thing in his Discovery of India. But when it came to defining it in political terms, he was hesitant because the influence of the European discourse and nationalism was predominant. So everybody in this country, Gandhiji always used to say, we should have Ramrajya in this country. The cultural idea of this country as Ramrajya used to present to the people. So India's national identity, national idea is different from that of the Europeans and Westerners. We must understand that India's national identity and cultural civilization, let me end by saying, today the whole country appreciates it. That's why you go to anybody, ask him to donate for Ram Mandir. So everybody is donating. A Muslim is donating, a Christian is donating, a Congress is donating, a BJP is donating. Everybody is donating because today that realization is there. That Ram symbolizes this nation's ancient identity. He is the greatest to unify around this country. And that is true today. Largely because of, I would say, the leaders who are leading the country today.
Rammodaji, you are from the RSS. You have been in it from your childhood. The RSS says it is a patriotic nationalist organization. It believes in the idea of India. Whatever is the idea of India, we talk about that later. In the idea of Indian civilization. It has its own viewpoints. Now there's another viewpoint, the westernized viewpoint, saying that patriotism, nationalism is bad, the RSS is a very narrow organization, anti-this, anti-that, communal, blah, blah, blah. And they try to impose their views. Do you think in India there's a clash of civilizations? Because there is a civilization idea borrowed from the West. Our leaders, sadly, were educated there. They had disdain for this country. They looked upon this country as a very poor, deprived country, barring Gandhi, barring Ambedkar, like you talk in your book. Nehru was a person who represented, after independence, the idea of a shining India. Not the old India, the cash-driven India, the busybodyish India, but a shining India, which will aid the West and follow the West. And they had borrowed these ideas, put it into textbooks, tried to brainwash all of us. So do you think we are seeing a clash of civilization, and that is why you have this thought, people writing to Biden and saying, don't put this is the RSS, this is Hindutva, this is this. Do you think this is really a clash of civilization between a construct of the West and a construct of India? And who do you think, but the people of India, in my view, think like Indians, like all of us. I mean, at the end of it, you may study this book and say, write all the exams and mouth all the things they want to say, but when it comes around temple, we go and pray and say Ramji is our unifier. So do you think the clash of civilization going on, how should we tackle this in the future? Because in the theme in your book, you written about it, it goes to a theme, but I want a very explicit explanation from you today before all this happens.
Yes, sir. I don't call it a clash of civilizations per se, because largely the opposition to the Indian ethos, Indian value system, or Indian idea of its national identity comes from a section of the elite, as I already said, influenced by certain Western ideas. And even they, I really don't know, really they believe what they say outside. Pandit Nehru, you mentioned him as one of those people who were influenced by very highly Western ideas. What was his will? After my death, my ashes should be strewn all over the country. Why should it be? What is the greatness of your ashes? Kamala Nehru's ashes were taken to Ganga and immersed in Ganga. See, most of it is superficial in our country. There was a time when it was fashionable also. Luckily today, there was a time when it used to be very fashionable to call ourselves secularists. We are very secular in 80s and 90s. Today, even if you want to say secular also, you will only say that privately. Sir, I am secular, sir. You won't say that openly because if you say secular, people will think you are a useless pseudo-secular. You are not real secular. These ideas today have been tested and rejected by large parts of India. I just give you two reasons for it. To trace the history, one must remember that these ideas came into India riding over the invaders, whether it was the Mughals who came first, who brought the Islamic ideas into India, or the British who brought the other Christian Semitic ideas into India. Missionaries brought them into India from West. They came with them. There was a period because of the ruling class, they were the ruling class, these ideas had a predominance over sections of Indian society. I mean, we read about Macaulay, how he tried to introduce an education system, about which he told the British Parliament that I will create a class of people who will be brown in skin color, but white in their thinking. so there was an effort made by the ruling class. I would say that the Mughal invaders, the Islamic invaders who came from outside, they essentially attacked the military might of this country, the Kshatriya Shakti. They defeated Rana Pratap, they defeated the other king, Raja Dahir, they tried to defeat Shivaji. Their fight was essentially with the military forces, whereas the British came and tried to destroy our intellect, our mind force, not the military force. Through their education, their very insidious ways, they tried to influence our thinking. We had a class of people, when the British left India, we had a class of people who carried that Western mantle for some decades. They had their heyday, but I think today their influence is definitely on the way for various reasons. The entire world has realized the futility of those ideas. The Semitic ideas are today largely rejected. So in India, that class is still there, but as you have correctly said, you go to average Indian society. I always tell this to our friends. You go to any one of the poorest states in India. Okay, not poorest. Take one of the largest states like Uttar Pradesh. Go to one of the most remotest districts in Uttar Pradesh. Go to a remotest village in Uttar Pradesh. Go to the last hut in that village, the poorest household in that village. Go to his hut. Go and see the life of the oldest lady in that hut. She she most probably will be uneducated, most probably. She will be in 80 years age. What is her morning prayer? Ganga Maya ki jai ho, Gomata ki jai ho, Tulsi Mata ki jai ho, and ends with Loka Kalyan ho. It starts with the good of the environment, surrounding, my neighbors, my people, my village, my country, and ends with Loka Kalyan. Who taught her all this? Which school she went to? This is the civilizational life of India. This is the dominant life of India, even to this day. But yes, in Delhi, in our certain institutions, in certain intellectual bodies, academic bodies, there are still remnants of those which carry that Western mantle. It's a battle. We will slowly but definitely defeat them. But when I say this, I always say one thing as a rider. I for one never consider everything that is Western as bad. In fact, that's not our culture. In fact, he was referring to the Ramo Bhadra Katavo and Vishwaka, that noble thoughts come from every side of the world. There are so many good things that we should learn from the West. The democratic values. After a lot of information, we today have them. These have to be cherished, these have to be protected. Rule abidingness. Today is the Republic Day. Look at what is happening in Delhi.
It happened in the US.
It happened in the US. It's happening in India today. Because, in fact, I take one more minute because Constitution, while completing the Constitution, Ambedkar said something very interesting. Ambedkar gave 3 warnings. I don't get into all the 3, but one warning he gave was, look, today we are, presenting you this Constitution. In the hope that country will run based on this Constitution. Until now, we were used to breaking the laws through revolution. सुभाष चंद्र बोस ने तो बड़ा आर्मी खड़ा कर दिया, भगत सिंह रेवोल्यूशन किया, ये सब किया. गांधी जी ने तो सहाय निराकरण किया, नॉन कोऑपरेशन, violating the laws, don't pay taxes, all that we did against British. Ambedkar said, now it is independence has come, you cannot continue with those methods. You now have to follow the constitutional methods only. That is patriotism. But what we are doing in Delhi streets today is violating the Constitution, violating the spirit of our Constitution, what Dr. Ambedkar has said. Rule abidingness is the strength of democracies. America flourished because of this rule abidingness. Today, they are also violating their rules. India also. Like that, I am saying there are many good things that you can imbibe from them. But on fundamental questions of culture, values, civilization, and national identity, we better turn inwards to our own great value system. That is what largely our leadership is trying to promote, and the country today largely accepts and internalizes.
My last question in this chapter, I think is an important question, sums up everything. Yes. We are told that the idea of India is the idea of one man, one family, staying in Delhi. And that's the idea we have to follow. We do anything apart from the idea. You're not an Indian, it's not the idea of India. The idea of India is in danger. Dharmadoti, according to you, what is the idea of India? Because for us, everybody is living the idea of India. We live in peace, we like our neighbors, we observe all the festivals, we do not discriminate, we move about with everybody, there's room for everybody, we are extremely tolerant, and we live it and we are happy. But somebody tells us that is not the idea of India. What one person said, one family said, one house says in Delhi, that is the idea of India. But what is the real idea of India according to you?
Like, idea of India is that there will be million ideas to live together. Not just one idea to be propagated by one family in Delhi or one party or one movement. So, essentially, idea of India is not something that you define. Like, as I said, that the village woman who taught her the idea of India. Where did she pick up all these things? That today you are talking about great environmental protection, climate change, etc., etc. She starts a prayer with Ganga Maya ki jai ho, Gomata ki jai ho, Tulsi Maya ki jai ho. The idea of India lies in its civilization, in its culture, the way we develop a value system, the way we look at the universe, the way we look at the creation, right from starting from creation to cremation, the whole process of our life, how we look at from a very Indian civilizational point of view. This is the real Indian idea. This idea of India never had any confusion until we came in confrontation, face to face, with some Western ideas, some Semitic ideas. Until they came, there was no confusion about the core idea. We were still fighting. I used to hear stories about how in Tamil Nadu, about a temple elephant, there used to be a fight over whether it should have cross this thing or straight namas. There used to be a lot of fight. We used to fight over this issue. But larger idea of divinity, all these things, there was never any confusion. We will fight till the end about that elephant's nama, whether it should be horizontal or vertical. By the time the judgment comes, the elephant will die. But our larger issue of our nation, our culture, our unity, our oneness, our God, our divinity, there was never any confusion. It occurred when you came face to face with a totally different worldview, the Semitic worldview. You believe that God is everywhere. आज भी हम मानते हैं कि भगवान सब दूर है. It's omnipresent everywhere. But you came in contact with the world which said, no. God is somewhere. I'm not criticizing them. That is their worldview. So from there to until your death, there is a totally different worldview which was brought before you and presented to you through the invaders. Because of their power, they tried to enforce it on us. That is when this whole confusion started. Whether our idea is the idea of India or what they are telling is the real idea of India. We should put an end to that confusion. Indian idea is to be derived from India's age-old civilizational and cultural experience, period. And out of this experience, as Mahatma Gandhi used to say, I will keep my doors open, my windows open, let all the breeze come from all sides into my house. I should not be swept up, that's all. I should not lose my balance. I am ready to take every good thing from other religions. But essentially, the Indian idea is it's civilizational experience, it's civilizational life. On that we have to today have a final consensus.
Thanks a lot, sir. Great questions. I think he's probably sweating already. Mr. Ramadoji, I will take it completely to a different angle before I open the questions to the audience. Growing up in 1980s, I heard that such and such a politician is on KGB funds, KGB agent. Then I used to hear that this person is a CIA agent. And even now we are hearing that these protests are done by Chinese, these protests are Pakistani funds and Soviet funds, whatever funds, external. You are a part of the government in many ways, right? What has been done or what can be done so that the next generation also is not in this foreign funding weakness? Because everybody has patriotism, everybody knows the idea of India, but some people are susceptible to do things like what happened today. What can be done or what has been done?
Look, be vigilant. The only duty of the citizens is to be eternally vigilant. Be careful about choosing the leaders. Be careful about choosing the parties. Country should be in safe hands. Today, luckily, we are in safe hands. We are in the hands of a leadership. I'm not just talking in terms of just politics alone. The whole thinking of this leadership is it is rooted in India's ethos. It is rooted in India's culture. I'm tempted to ask all our friends here. We have been an independent nation for 30 decades. when did we see a Prime Minister wearing tilak on his forehead, going and praying before the God? What is wrong with us? Joe Biden takes work on the Bible. It is not wrong there. We have this very confused notion about all these things, secularism, all these ideas. India should be proud of its cultural civilization and heritage. We should be proudly wearing it on our sleeve. Today we have a lady who wears it on our sleeve. And sometimes people call us fundamentalists. I always tell them, look, I don't talk about other religions. What happens if one becomes a fundamentalist in their religion? I don't know how to talk, you all know what happens. You are seeing it. But assuming for a moment that a Hindu becomes a fundamentalist, what are the fundamentals of Hinduism? Sarve Sukhina Santu. That is my fundamental. Amo Bhadra Chakravu Yantu that is my fundamental. Loka Kalyan Ho, that is my fundamental. So if a Hindu becomes a fundamentalist, he will do good to the entire mankind. So in that sense of the greater value system to which I belong, I will be happy to be a fundamentalist. But you should have that clarity, that courage, and that courage of conviction. You should. Sometimes people have conviction, as I mentioned to you. Nehru had real conviction about Indian civilization's greatness. That's why I said, reading the History of India. It is as good as a book written by any so-called right winger. But he lacked the courage of conviction. Whereas you have a leader who has the courage of conviction also. So, vigilant rahiye. Sahi leader ko aage le jaiye. That is the only thing that is expected of the citizens of the country.
Let me ask you one question. Ram Madhurji, you were a very important part of the Kashmir initiative for the last 5 years. What exactly is the Kashmir problem? You written about the historical, historical blunder. You written about, confronting history, talking about Kashmir. You went to Kashmir. You cobbled the government together, I think. Didn't work. It blew up. Then we had 370 going away, 35 going away, the Shahid Bagh coming, all these kind of things coming. And what is the status today? Have you succeeded in making, Kashmir is always ours. Have you succeeded in solving the problem? Is there going to be a solution? How do you handle Pakistan claims on Kashmir? What should we do? Do you think we are on the right path and it is very positive for us?
Thank you, Mr. Pai. It's a very important question. See, what happened at the time of independence was, we handed over the Kashmir to a few ruling families. Article 370, that was surreptitiously inserted into our constitution. I am saying surreptitiously because even Congress Working Committee in 1949 had passed a resolution rejecting this article to be inserted in the constitution. Congress Working Committee. Yes, Nehru had that jib. Nehru insisted that no, I gave a word to Sheikh Abdullah. So essentially, Article 370 was created to pacify, please and satisfy Sheikh Abdullah. Not for the interest of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. For that matter, Jammu and Kashmir people never asked for it. And I tell you something more startling. I have written about it. In 1963, the leaders of Jammu and Kashmir, the Kashmir Valley leaders, the Muslim leaders, came to Nehru saying that what is this nonsense 370? It is only helping the Abdullah family. Please remove it. We don't want it. It's not helping people. Nehru ne kaha, no. Gis jayega. It will erode and corrode by itself. People were never taken into cognizance by introducing this Article 370. As a result, in the last 7 decades, Article 370 has only helped a few families in the Kashmir Valley. They were the beneficiaries. hardly speaking, some 200 to 300 families. Only they were the beneficiaries. We decided that no, we should go. We needed to, in order for us to take that drastic decision, because these 300 families are the main people who will come onto the streets, then they will bring, their chelas onto the streets. So what we did was, we put these 300 people behind bars. Temporarily, for some time. Look, 300 people in jail for 6 months. Kashmir was so peaceful. Nobody came onto the streets. And I used to go. I used to think that, yeah, कोई तो हमारे पास आए protest करने के लिए कि why have you put these people behind bars? On the contrary, people used to walk up to us and tell us privately, "Sir, अच्छा किया है, जल्दी मत छोड़िए." That is the sentiment of the people. We never cared for it. We only cared for some Abdullah, some Muftis, only these people. I respect them, they are leaders. But they never really bothered or cared for the ordinary Kashmiris. That's why when they were incarcerated, although temporarily, we never had the intention to put them behind bars for so many years, but temporarily they were incarcerated, people did not complain. And also abrogation of Article 370, people did not complain in a big way. Some people tell me, no, because you had security forces, that's why people were scared to come out. Sir, I know Kashmir so well. We had security forces presence all the time in Kashmir. Burhan Wali incident happened in 2016. We deployed huge security forces. Yet, on a given day, sometimes 500 places, there used to be protests on a given day, one day. But when 370 was removed, no protests. Because people understood that 370 was helping only some families, not really the ordinary Kashmiris. Kashmiris now want to give life without 370 a chance. So that is where the responsibility of the government is. It has to now give the confidence to people that without 370 my life is better. That's what the government is trying to do now. Having said it, I want to add a very, very important footnote. As Mr. Pai said, we said Kashmiri lovers. मैं तो संग में हूँ, हम शाखा में खेल खेलते थे, खेल में नारा होता था, जम्मू कश्मीर हमारा है. We used to give the slogan. हमारे विद्यार्थी परिषद वाले added one more line. जम्मू कश्मीर हमारा है, वो कश्मीर हमारा है जो सारा का सारा है. Friends, I have a chapter on it. I have an essay on it. When we say Kashmiri lovers, what do we mean? कश्मीर हमारा है का अर्थ होना चाहिए हर कश्मीरी हमारा है. When you say Kashmir is ours, you should convey this sentiment to Kashmiri people that when I say Kashmir is ours, I'm not talking about the geography. I'm not talking about the territory. I'm talking about every Kashmiri. 1.3 crore Kashmiris are my own people. That sense of belongingness has to be given to Kashmiri people. Kashmiris are waiting for that. So, I have an appeal to make to all of you. We want Kashmir to now become like any other state, like Karnataka, like Maharashtra, like Bengal. But, Bengal is political Bengal. But generally I am speaking like any other state in the country. But, for that to happen, government is doing, we are doing a lot of governmental activity and all that. My appeal to all of you is, when you plan your next holiday, plan it to Srinagar. When you plan for your next pilgrimage, plan it to Amarnath or Vaishno Devi. And with less experience, I can tell you, when you plan your next honeymoon, plan it to Gulmarg. Now, I said it, somebody told me, sir, you have no experience, there won't be next honeymoon, there is only one honeymoon. He corrected me. Later on, I got a WhatsApp. One person sent me a WhatsApp saying, no, your moderator is wrong. There can be many honeymoons. So, I appeal to you, next honeymoon, go to Gulmarg. What I am trying to say is, Today, government has done its part, and it's time to do whatever is required. But as people, we are supposed to now embrace the Kashmiris so that they don't become, targets of a very focused campaign against Delhi, against India, against BJP. So I urge all of you to please play some active role in that, embracing Kashmiris with rest of the country.
This is a question close to my heart. You talk about liberal fascists. I too think all these people are not liberal, they're fascists. Because a true liberal will defend to the death your right to your own opinion without shutting you out, cancelling you, or stopping you. And these people don't do that. Do you think what we see in Delhi, particularly in Delhi, maybe in Delhi, AMU is a communal thing, Jamia Millia is communal, JNU is extreme leftist, Maoist, but in Delhi, do you think it is the old elite trying to fight their way back to power because they have lost power? Do you think it's a clash of power right now, not civilizations, that's over now, it's a clash of power. And these are the real fascists and not liberals. Why do people call them liberals when they're fascists? You written about it. What is your view of all this thought that comes out, these people going around the world, trying to badmouth India, trying to create all these fake narratives, this part of the media doing all that? When are we going to see a different kind of India where we can genuinely have a debate without all this kind of abuses?
Yeah, absolutely. They are not true liberals. See, liberal with capital L is a noble idea. There are radical liberals in the West. They are bad people, I agree. But liberalism per se is a good idea. It stood for the rights of the marginalized people, it stood for the poor, stood for certain noble ideas like environmental protection, etc. In that sense, every Hindu is a real capital L liberal. We are liberals. But the liberals, generally I don't use these kind of words, but for the sake of understanding, I'm using the gang. We come across in the name of liberals. They are not really liberals. They only want their way. It's about Jagbush. My way or highway. You have to accept me. Whatever I say is the way you should follow. So they don't tolerate you. They don't tolerate a different viewpoint. They will abuse you. Today, my students tell me, our Indian students tell me, when they go to some universities in the West, just if they happen to support one good policy of this government, there is no debate over the merits of it. He will be immediately denounced. He is abused. He is harassed. He is trod. These are liberals. They are actually fascists. They are not liberals. Whether you are a liberal, you are a conservative, these are all certain ideas. But the basic thing is, you should agree that there will be a different viewpoint. You should have tolerance to other viewpoint. That is real liberalism. You are liberal means you tolerate the viewpoint. I tell you, Swami Vivekananda went all the way to Chicago to tell the world. When the Christian missionaries through World Parliament of Religions were trying to propagate the idea of tolerance in religion. Tolerance in their sense was that, there are other religions in the world. They are these idol worshippers, hopeless people, but Christianity should tolerate them. This was the idea. Tolerance is arrogance. Vivekananda went and said, I come from a country where we do not just tolerate, but validate and accept every idea. We accept every idea as valid idea. We accept it. And not only that, he went one step forward and said, we celebrate the diversity. We celebrate. That is liberalism. You are not even ready to listen to the other viewpoint. How can you be a liberal? So these liberals, so-called liberals in our country, they are not really liberals, they are the real fascists. Fascists used to thrust their idea on people. Those who do not agree will be punished. will be thrown out, they will be sent to gulags. That was fascism in Russia, Soviet Union, that was fascism in Italy and Germany. We have such fascists in the name of liberals in India, so don't credit them with the title liberals. They are not liberals, they are pseudo-liberals. They are real fascists. That's the article I wrote as one of the articles.
Fantastic moment over here. Now, as we promised, this is your chance to ask some questions, but two requests. Let the questions be very specific to nationalism, identity, and culture. You already put him in a hot seat asking a lot of hot questions. So, as long as they are within that, we will. And also, please ask very short questions. Okay? Please go ahead. Yeah. Let's go with the green shirt there. You come here 1 second. Just introduce yourself and ask questions.
Myself, I'm Srinivasan from Youth for Parivartan. So I consider this book to be re-educating the wrongly educated. So coming to my question, we normally go to schools and hold nationalistic events there to teach nationality to kids. But some schools tell us, okay, if you come to our school and talk about humanity, because those schools say we consider humanity over nationality. This statement called humanity over nationality seems very cheesy, but is it really valid? That's my question.
Okay, I mean, we have in the education system, we have a number of shortcomings and flaws. There are people who propagate different kinds of ideas. In many cases, our textbooks propagate different kinds of ideas. I mean, all very funny ideas. I have a simple submission to make here. We are making a lot of efforts to at least mainstream the national education. I mean, the government public education should be mainstream to teach right things to the people. That effort will go on through new education policy, etc. You are also a part of that whole new education policy exercise and all. But I have a very fundamental question to ask. I think we have to turn our attention to that. How much time does a pupil, a student, spend in the school? 5 days in a week, 5 hours a day. Where is he rest of the time? Home or outside? 8 घंटा भी सो जाता है, फिर भी he left with 11 hours. When I was a child, probably he was a child, there is a need to revive the multiple centers of education in our country, not just the formal education that one child receives in the school. That's important. That needs to be addressed. But a child learns so much right from his family to his community. All those other institutions have collapsed today because we come back from office and we immediately turn to Netflix. Where is the time to teach your children? Good things about the country, good things about the society, about our culture. So we need to start with our family. We have to revive temples as education centers. I used to go from my shaka every week to temple. One attraction was prasadam. We used to get good prasadam food. But more than prasadam, there used to be a person who would have a Burrakatha. He would narrate lots of things through that katha. So we used to go and half an hour we listen to him. That was my education. What happened to those institutions today? We need to revive all those things. Friends, here I give compliments to certain religious orders, certain Western religious orders. Insist on every follower to go to either a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a Buddhist vihara every week. I have very close relations with Sri Lanka. One monk once told me, sir, do you know in Sri Lanka, largest conversions happen in northern areas where Tamils live. I said, why not in other areas where Buddhists live? They say, we run Sunday schools, we don't let our children convert. They run Sunday schools where children are sent. So we have to also think about the way of inculcating our value system through other means. Well, education is important. Please pay attention to that also.
Great answer. So you can ask questions to any of the gentlemen. Please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. My name is Chirag, and I have this question. In the Constitution, Article 44 clearly says uniform civil code for all the citizens. Article 48 says forced slaughter is banned, and Article 370 already it is mentioned that autonomy for Jammu and Kashmir is just temporary. Still, why do you think it's mandatory for the government to go through all the procedures like implementing the law and facing against the riots and all those kind of things.
You mean why are Article 44 and 48 not implemented in our country? That's what you are asking.
It's already mentioned in the constitution.
But why are they not fully implemented?
Yeah.
That's what. Okay, I mean, सबका नंबर आएगा. इस तरह का लोग एक आएगा, फिर गया है, एक याद आ रहा है तो अच्छा नहीं है. But having said it about uniform civil code, we have the abrogation of triple talaq is actually one step forward in bringing uniform civil code, because today Muslim personal law is actually limited to 4 or 5 items: marriage, divorce, adoption, succession and inheritance. These are the 5 areas in which a special law is there in the form of Muslim personal law. In that, divorce को हमने हटा दिया. Divorce हटा दिया तो marriage भी हट गया, single marriage हो गया. क्योंकि you cannot should have one uniform law. It's actually mandated by Supreme Court 3 times. As far as spouse slaughter, I tell you, at least 22 Indian states have spouse slaughter laws. The problem is about implementation. States do not have seriousness to implement them. We need to think more seriously about implementing these laws.
Ram Madhuji, in the guise of personal laws, you are discriminating against Indian women. Now, in a Hindu law, because the court is said, men and women are equal. There is no discrimination, because there was a discrimination in the inheritance of the girl child of a parent's property that is gone because of law. Why can't we have a law called Indian Women Right to Equality Law, wherein we say all Indian women, irrespective of caste, religion, will have equal rights to men, including 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, exactly the 5 things that you said. And this will be applicable to all women. Now, instead of talking about uniform civil code, why can't we bring this law to give equal rights to men? Because in the Sabrimala case, which I don't think many people have read, and they talk about it, Justice Chandrachud said, Article 14 overrides, I think, Article 25, 26, which is religion. Article 14 overrides. Article 14 is about equality. Now, under personal law, there is no equality between a man and a woman. Woman is faced a lower disadvantaged situation like a chattel. Now, why can't we bring this law in Parliament? Who will oppose it? Indian Women Right to Equality Act. All Indian women who are engaged should have equal rights. Why can't we do that?
It's a very good suggestion. Yeah, we should think about it.
Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. Whenever discussions on nationalism come up, one of the important themes that come up is also the history writing thing, the nationalist historiography as such. After historians like Asim Majumdar and Jagannath Sarkar, we really don't have nationalist historians. The entire history writing project was taken over by the JNU faculty. A lot of people like Rajiv Malhotra and Dr. Meenakshi Jain and Dr. Subramanian Swamy have been repeatedly pitching for the rewriting of India's history from a nationalist point of view. What is the government's consideration on this, and is there any progress? Because we are not seeing any results in the new economic policy, specifically relating to history writing.
Okay, what you said is true. The history writing was taken over by left-leaning intellectuals in mid-60s. Until then, you had people like Jagannath Sarkar. But they took over, especially in 1967-68, they took over the Indian History Congress, and from then on, the whole enterprise became a very whitewashing exercise. Began from then onwards. Now, the challenge is, okay, government should write history or not is a debatable question. We need historians to write. Like you mentioned about a few days. Like that, we need many more historians. To come a textbook, sometimes the expectation is that the author should be a historian, qualified historian, because he should know the historiography, what is called the method of writing history, methodology of writing history. So we need more and more people like Meenakshi Jain. Since you mentioned her name, I'm saying. So we, unfortunately, I will ask, how many of us will opt for history? We would rather opt for engineering, go to America. We we unfortunately don't have too many people opting for the social sciences area. We need more people who actually take history as their subject and study, acquire degrees and come up with good historical text. Today that number is increasing, but we need more and more people, trained historians. Very true what you are saying.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Akshay Aladi. My name is Akshay Aladi. My key question is on the institutions of the state itself as defined in the Constitution. Now, the Constitution itself, of course, is like the bedrock of our modern state. But in what ways do you see that as evolving, the major institutions as evolving, so that they reflect better the fundamental civilization and cultural ethos of this country? What should we retain as very good ideas that we have in the Constitution, and what should we seek to modify or reflect better in terms of our civilization and our culture, in terms of the institutions of the state?
Look, I would say that the fundamental confusion we had at the time of the making of the Constitution as to whether we should call ourselves a nation or not, or we should only call ourselves a people, that has been, I think, conclusively addressed today. Largely, people say that we are an ancient nation, a civilization nation. Having addressed it, I propose that we have to now do three things as a polity. Number one, we need to revisit Gandhiji's Ramarajya idea. Why I am saying this is, Ramarajya is not about any Hindu state or anything. In fact, Gandhiji himself said, I am not talking about any theological state. But by Ramarajya, what Gandhiji meant was a non-majoritarian model of democracy. You will still have democracy, but democracy doesn't become a majoritarian rule. It's a majority rule. Democracy is by very nature are majority-centric. You have a majority, you will rule the government. But with a 30% vote also I can rule. Because if the other vote is given again, 30% is the majority. So, majority governments with non-majoritarian governance. That is what is called Ramarajya. Gandhiji at least explained it that way. Gandhiji said, Ramarajya, by Ramarajya what I mean is the voices of the voiceless also are reflected in governance. So, we need to first of all revisit that. For revisiting it, please don't take it otherwise. I am making a only theoretical proposition today. We have, when Greek city-states started democracy, that time the democracy meant what people together decide was democracy. So in a sense, all the 21,000 educated people, I mean not all had rights to participate, 21,000 people had the right to participate, 21,000 people decided that Socrates was a treacherous fellow. He committed treason. He sided with Sparta. So they gave the option to Socrates, either you kill yourself or we will kill you, in a most democratic way. So Socrates consumed poison and died. So that was the beginning of democracy. Then it was realized that no, keval majority se nahi chalega. So you need some kind of a balance. So that is when we created a judiciary. So majorities can decide, but judiciary also has to agree. Remember, judiciary is a non-elected institution. We had a balance between elected institutions and non-elected institutions. Media is a non-elected institution. Civil organizations are non-elected. Commissions are non-elected. Election Commission is not elected. Vigilance Commission is not elected. Anti-corruption body we create non-elected. They are the balancing factors. We need to create a healthy balance. If judiciary, media, everybody also becomes a majoritarian voice, then where will non-majorities go? Ramarajya is about building consensus using majority institution of parliament and non-majority institutions of judiciary, media, etc. Today, nobody is playing their role. So, number one, we must revisit Ramarajya and build a new model of democracy in India, a consensus-based model. Number two, Ambedkar said about social democracy. You have political democracy in India, but this won't succeed unless you have social democracy. By social democracy, we did not mean participation, give reservations to this section, give reservation to that section, women को भी reservation दे दो, सबको reservation दे दो, social democracy हो गया. No, he said democracy, what I meant was every stakeholder, every section of the society should feel the stakeholdership in decision making. अगर कोई डिसीजन हो रहा है उसमें मेरा हिस्सा है कि नहीं, मैं भी उसमें मेरा भी योगदान है कि नहीं. So larger stakeholdership of the society, how do we build? There outside the government we need to work on building social democracy in the country. That is number 2 we have to achieve. Number 3, what Gandhi to Vinoba to Deendayal Upadhyay said, Antyodaya. You need to create grassroots prosperity. India, our dharma is for prosperity, friends. It is for happiness. We are a dharma of happiness. But somehow this weird idea that आपको सब कुछ छोड़ देना है, वो नहीं है. It is a life of happiness, life of bliss. How do you create it at the grassroots? What is our most common mantra in Hinduism? Sarve Sukhinah Santu. What is that mantra about? सब सुखी रहे, सर्वे सुखिनः सन्तु. सर्वे सन्तु निरामया, किसी को कोई कष्ट नहीं होना है. सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु. Everybody should enjoy goods in life. भद्राणि यानी आपके घर में कार होना है, टीवी होना है, फ्रिज होना है. भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, good things in life. माँ का सी दुख मापिया, किसी को दुख ही नहीं होना है. It's the most material prayer. But remember, the operational word in the prayer is sarvepi. Everybody should be happy. For everybody to be happy, everybody else should sacrifice. For everybody to be healthy, everybody else should contribute. So this is Hinduism. You have to create grassroots prosperity, grassroots happiness. We need to today work towards that. India is reaching $5 trillion economy. मेरे पास डॉक्टर मुशब्बाई बैठे हैं, वो इंडियन इकोनॉमी को $5 trillion तो देने ही जाएंगे. India become $5 trillion economy will automatically happen because of people like him. And we will become 5th largest economy, which we have already become. But do you know, in per capita GDP, we are 158. You need to create grassroots prosperity. That is where you need to really find new methods. In fact, I tell everybody, every institution, that create prosperity lab in your university. Prosperity lab. You need to apply your minds to creating grassroots prosperity. How do you create it? So that is the kind of new approach we have to take. That is our dharma. Let me conclude by giving you one very interesting anecdote that my own experience. One day I was in Beijing in my university talking to some professors in a conference. One professor told me that look, I generally said in 1990, you and we both had almost identical GDP. Today we use something ahead, we will also try to catch up. He said, you will never be able to catch up. I thought it is a little arrogant. But he said, the next sentence startled me. He said, you can't catch up with China because you are worshippers of poverty. I was taken away. What do you mean worshippers of poverty? आप तो संत महात्माओं के पीछे लगते हो. आप तो जो एक छोटा सा वस्त्र पहनकर घूमता है, उनको भगवान मानते हो, तो साष्टांग प्रणाम करते हो. मैंने यार, you don't understand our civilization. We respect sacrifice. It's our culture. Then I started thinking that culture has been misunderstood by us. That everybody should be like, सब कुछ छोड़ के रहना. Our culture is also about happiness. Anand is the essence of Hinduism. We need to create a grassroots prosperity, friends. That is what Prime Minister is saying. आत्मनिर्भर बनना है, वो है grassroots prosperity. Grassroots पे आज समाज को खड़ा करना है. So I think these three should be our future, agenda items for building institutions: Ram Rajya, social democracy, and Antyodaya.
Good evening, sir. My name is Vijay Lakshmi, and I am from the social media team from BAC, which is Bangalore Central. So sometimes as a part of this job, I keep posting and reposting a lot of posts, and one of these things is what related to our topic of discussion right now. So Hindus don't need anything, just government, from government, just release Hindus from the shackles of constitution which have taken control over temples, and Article 2530 which forbade us to spread knowledge about Sanatana Dharma, etc., etc. But my concern here is about one response what I got. So we keep getting normally so many responses, but however, this was like very distasteful to see this kind of statements. Proves your education does not provide civic and social science. So I'll not read the rest of the thing, but here is one thing which says, it says that something that our family, education and social environment has failed to do in the past, which led to the global destruction of the world. Where is positivity? Where is love? So when I say this, the millennials are the future and they don't care about communalism. Sad to see what the generation of 70s, 80s and 90s have done to this world. You guys have to pause and reflect. This made me think. So I would like to ask you is, how would you explain the concept of India comes first to some of these misguided millennials? I mean, the self-proclaimed millennials as what they call themselves.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, that is really the challenge before all of us. The newer generations, how do we inculcate these values in them? One thing that we must remember is the new generation is very different from the old generations, the generations to which we belong. Today's generation has access to more avenues of knowledge, more more avenues of information. They know many more things already. So herein lies the challenge of presenting our ideas and our values in a very most, I would call it cheap way. Hinduism should be fashionable. This is a challenge for all of us. Think about it. I mean, I should feel proud to be a Hindu. That kind of new way of articulating these great ideas are so great. The whole world today is talking about what we have been talking for ages. What is this climate change after all? Something that we have been talking about for ages. In the first Earth Summit, Indira Gandhi went in 1981 to Rio de Janeiro. She quoted Prithvi Suktam, Mata Prithvi Putra Prithvya. In fact, one of her relatives once told me, when she went after 10 years, the attendants asked her, where your so-and-so came, Indira Gandhi came. She recited a shloka. Can you please tell us what is all about it? This lady had no idea about the shloka. She said, so I'm saying the world is today actually looking at these ideas only. But we have to now find ways of presenting these things in a manner that a millennial can accept it. That is a real challenge. I saw Chinmayananda doing it. We saw one Vivekananda doing it. I mean, even to this day, we need a Vivekananda to inspire our youngsters. When we talk to youngsters, we quote Vivekananda. Because after Vivekananda, after Chinmayananda, we are not finding people like that. So it's also a challenge to, as you very rightly pointed out, present this religion, this dharma, in the most contemporary way to our youngsters. It can be done. We do it, but we need more and more people to do it.
So my apologies to the rest of the people. I still need to take many questions. Okay, so he has picked one last question. Please go ahead. And my apologies to others.
Namaste sir, my name is Pratika. Thank you for the last comment you made about making Hinduism cool and chic to the millennials. I totally agree. There is a common leitmotif that I observe amongst all the panelists. Most of you quoted liberally from Sanskrit. I want to point out a few things before coming to the point. You know, we have our External Affairs Ministry that issues press releases in all languages, Indian languages. There's no press release in Sanskrit. The first press release is in Urdu. English, Hindi succeed that. Okay, it's a data point. So how you want to address it, I leave it to you. The second thing is that, every time we go onto a global platform, the one thing we say is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I would like to ask you, don't you think every ministry should have a motto? And assuming they do have a motto, shouldn't this be the motto of the External Affairs Ministry? two. The second thing is, someone pointed out that the concept of a nation state is increasingly becoming irrelevant to a millennial. I would agree, because they can work from the remotest parts of the country, and their employer can be anywhere else in the world. So they have scant respect for national boundaries, because they feel that the nation is not enabling me in any way. Many millennials are not part of the so-called education system, the formal education system as defined by the government. They all go to private schools and so on, and some of them go to uber private schools. So they have scant respect for what you call national boundaries. If you take this principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, I think it's a great way of making Hinduism cool to begin with for the millennials. The fourth thing, all of them look for hero figures. I don't think there is any shortage, when we talk about Bharata as a civilization, but all the reference points I see do not go beyond Gandhiji, right? And, we don't have any shortage of sages, be it of any gender dispensation, rishis, sadhvis, who are uber figures when it comes to ability, right? The greatest among them, every single person today worships a screen, right? The screen is possible because of a 23-year-old boy saint, literally a boy saint, right? Who none of the millennials know. The person who discovered zero. So I think if we have, there are two ways to address this. One is, sorry, I'm just making data points here. So one is that we counter narratives. Two is we create a narrative. I think the time has come to create an indie narrative. And that is done through the same Netflix that everybody comes back to watch. That is the other thing I wanted to say. And so you mentioned Semitic invasion. Semites have never fought their own war. For 2,000 years, Christians fought their war. For 800 years, Islamists have fought their war. After that, the Semitic people who control business all over the world have fought their war. Today, if you name the 20 or 30 richest people on the planet, they're all Semites. And they make sure that information flow is controlled. In some way, if we can do a narrative, leveraging what the Semites have built, I think it would be a great.
Information flow, by the way, is controlled by Sundar Pichai.
Yeah, but Sundar Pichai, all three of Sundar Pichai's bosses are Semites.
No, that's okay. Look, only one point I want to make. Okay, there are good suggestions, we should do them. But don't talk about nation state with the millennials. They have their own ideas about politics. Nation, many youngsters appreciate. They understand it. They understand the value of our nation, our national identity, our culture, our civilization. As you said, our glorious idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all these things, our youngsters appreciate very well. But only thing is, as you also said, we need to present it in a non-offensive way. It's not against somebody. It's as a noble idea. We should present it. They will certainly appreciate it. Other sessions are good sessions.
I just want to make a point. It's a very important point to make. We have to become rich. Only when you're rich, you take pride. Look at China. The Chinese young people feel that they're better than America. They're richer than America. Shanghai is better than New York. They're all going and buying this old Ming vases. All that was looted from the Pleasure Palace in 1864 by the Western forces, which are in museums, so they're buying it back. They're building their cultural artifacts. They're building their past. They're creating glorious history. Why Panam? They have money. 15 trillion GDP, 4 trillion reserves. They're investing $1 trillion Belt and Road. So all of us have to work hard, make India rich, create grassroots prosperity. Nobody should live in want. Now, I just want to make one point which I think we should know. Narendra Modi is the only Prime Minister of this country in India's pre-history who has done the most for the poor in this country. And by 2022, every Indian will have and the road to the house, and health facilities, health insurance, and reasonable prospects of jobs for them and their children. It will happen. It will happen in 7 years. Nobody has done as much for the poor of this country in 7 years or 8 years like Narendra Modi and the BJP government has done. That is when you get pride in India. Because why? You become proud of your country when you are there. Ramanuji, when I should travel outside in 25 years, I see the passport, dirty fellow, Indian, poor fellow, they should look at me and all. After 5 years, oh, Indian, Bangalore, IT. Oh, come. They welcome me. Why? Because we have become powerful. Technology is the peak of the pyramid. We are doing well. So we must work hard. We must become rich. We must follow compassionate capitalism. We must create grassroots prosperity. Every Indian should get the necessities of life. And we in this room have to ensure that. If you do that, this pride will come. And the millennial will say, Mera Bharat Maan.
This noble ideas, great Indian ideas that have reached out to the entire world, they all happened at a time when India was one of the richest countries in the world. It was in the first 1000 to 1400 years when India was the most, leading exporting nation in the world. It was then that we exported goods but also exported ideas. So as Mr. Pai pointed out, as I said, prosperity we have to create in this country. We need to create India, rich India. No other way.
So, fantastic thoughts. If you remember today, the Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh lotus, the tableaus, it was all about Vijayanagara. The richest Hindu kingdom or richest kingdom on the planet 500 years. And what a way to end today's great thoughts with cheering stuff. So we thank a lot.
Can we leave a provocative idea?
Yes.
Since you talked about Vijayanagara Empire, we talk about all our empires, which were all city-states. India developed in cities as much as it dwelled in villages. Today, this glorious, romantic idea that India lives in villages. No. Historically, India is a city civilization. We were rich people, we were exporting, we were making life easy for people. What is Vijayanagara? It's a city empire, major city empire, urban empire. So, this whole negativity about urban life it also should go. Okay, I mean, you need to devise ways of taking these goods in life to villages. That's why Abdul Kalam said Pura, providing urban amenities in rural areas. So, this is the kind of India we have to build, rich, prosperous India. Then only these universal ideas will be accepted by the world.
Post this recipient and exciting discussion on why Indians need to acknowledge their past heritage and humiliations and put their present needs and aspirations first. I think one can make a very well-grounded argument that there exists sufficient cause in this age of internationalism that we, the people of Bharat, exert our Bharatiyata, pursue individual goals for the sake of the nation, but cow not down to the pressures of westernization. It shall serve us well to remember that only sword-wielding hands can command peace, and the sword of the 21st century is manifested in education, exposure, expertise, and most of all, innovation. I now request Putri Ji to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you.
It's my honor today to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of entire Ballista Bharati. So before going ahead, I just have a note. The books are available for sale, and we have a special offer also. You can get autograph of Sri Ramadanji also, Mohan Daspai and Kiran KS. So do buy the books. Firstly, I would like to thank and express my sincere thanks to the three eminent personalities of this evening, Sri Ramadanji, Sri Mohan Daspai and Sri Kiranji. Amidst of their busy schedule, they have made time to our event and share their knowledge. So we are grateful. I would like to thank Sri Manjunath, who is the main pillar of support to Ballista Bharat. Our sincere thanks to Sri Rajesh Parmaji for guiding us throughout and supporting to create this successfully. Our thanks to Sri M.L. Shivakumar, ever energetic and backbone of Sri Ballista Bharat. My huge thanks to Sri Punit, Anil, Harijit, Harish, Vijendra, Ravi, Nihal, Abhijit, Pramod,
Vyas, Darshan Desai, and to our entire team and to our whole friends who have become a family of Malaysia Bharat. My special thanks to my parents for their unconditional support, and most important, without whom this event wouldn't have been successful, our deepest thanks to the entire nationalist audience present here. Thank you all for showing support. We are really grateful. Now I request everyone to please stand up for the national song. Song would be played now.